It's a lot of nonsense.
Idiots saying nonsense.
Enough of this nonsense. Nonsense! Nonsense!
Layers and layers of nonsense.
What is this nonsense?
Nonsense is everywhere, surrounding us like an invisible cloud.
Nonsense in a brand new light.
That is what is nonsense.
Every day they write articles on nonsense.
A little nonsense now relished by the wisest.
Nonsense.
Hello and welcome to Nonsense, the podcast where no topic is off topic and we explore the depths of the nonsensical world in which we currently find ourselves living. Today I'm joined by Peter Moon. He's a brilliant author, researcher, and I go so far as to say scientist, whose work covers a wide variety of topics from time travel to consciousness. His explorations into the various connections between the ancient world, the occult, and the modern secrets programs within the government are unparalleled and truly exciting to explore. So grateful to have you on the show with us today. Thanks for being here.
It's nice to be here with you, Dylan.
So to start things off, would you mind giving us a little brief background on kind of who you are and the books you've written and the topics that you explore?
Okay, well, I rose to noteworthiness as a result of ghostwriting and publishing the book, The Montauk Project's Experiments in Time, the primary author of which was Preston Nichols, who had incredible experiences of being a time travel scientist. And he was the foremost expert on electromagnetics in his day, probably still would be today. He was an engineer, a technician, and a pure scientist who was just brilliant, but he was also found out that he'd been living in other realities, which can easily be interpreted as psychosis. Although when you'll have to look between the lines, you see that he was involved in a very mad drama that did involve the manipulation of time and mind control.
Wow. So your most popular book is The Montauk Project, which does heavily explore time travel. Would you be able to touch a little bit on some of the different types of time travel? Kind of going into what, like, are there machines, or is time travel something that would be more astral or spiritual or meditative?
Time travel is the whole idea of leaving the reference points of the third dimension. We live in 3 dimensions. So when you leave the reference points of the third dimension, which could be done consciously, it could be done physically, and when you begin to imagine it, there is a link between imagination and so-called objective reality. So people can work with these things. But as far as different types, there's actually, I suppose you could say there's only one type, but how you do it is up to the doer. Just like if there's many different fighting styles in martial arts, mm-hmm. What is the one that's going to work? That's all I would say. I have been introduced to ideas by Preston Nichols through complex circumstances and complex machinery, which nobody seemed to understand too well, save for him. And there were other people who understood certain aspects of it, but he had a certain mastery of it. But the main problem was obtaining the power to do it, having enough raw horsepower to, and I'm talking about mechanical power, to affect time, which is a whole scientific approach or discussion one could have. But that's what he had. The work of Preston Nichols was very groundbreaking because it demonstrated that there was a project that operated clandestinely underneath the Montauk Air Force Station, also known as Camp Hero, and that there was literally a conspiracy to keep the activities there silent and quiet, which we proved beyond any shadow of a doubt. What we could not prove was we couldn't show somebody time travel itself. What we did get in return for all our efforts was the appearance of a very unique man named Dr. David Anderson, who appeared to us in 1999 at one of our monthly meetings. And over the years, he developed what he calls a time reactor. And a time reactor, at the time we met him, it could slow down or speed things up about the size of a small a soccer ball. It could slow time or speed time up. Now, I was able to see a video of this machine work. That's the closest I've seen to his device. He developed it in between then and 2010. Now, I didn't see the device until 2010 when he developed his bigger machine, better machine, which he said could take humans back into time or forward into time. And furthermore, this was 2 years after I had gone to Romania and attended and participated in his lectures on the scientific theory of time travel, which took me 5 years before I could break it down into simple 8th grade English, which is now on the English and Math in the timetraveleducationcenter.com, which anybody can go to and see free videos that explain the science and math of time travel, showing that time travel is within the bounds of ordinary math and physics. It does not require quantum physics nor atomic physics. It's very simple. But he said the main problem is people are so indoctrinated into what they're indoctrinated to, they just can't break out of it. So even if you're a highly intelligent PhD or college student, it might take a couple of goings through to quote unquote get it, to get how simple it is. Once we have established that it's theoretically simple to understand, the technology behind it is very vast. And it's at least 20 years of learning curve for Dr. David Anderson. And that was 20 years before he developed it to the point where I just described. He's developed it far beyond that for the last 10 years, which I'm not privy to very much at all in the last 10 years, only a little bit, because my interaction with him has always been fleeting and minimal, but always extremely interesting.
Wild. Speaking a little bit more about the time travel stuff, are you familiar with what's referred to, I guess, as Project Looking Glass?
I have heard of it, but I do know that the purveyors of it, the main one being Sean David Morton, had to be locked up. He had to be locked up because he was crazy and he was criminal. And consequently, when you have people like that promoting this, I know, and he's promoted other false things and spurious things. So I show no interest. He's trying to co-opt the subject, okay, and ultimately doesn't do a very good job of it. But he's locked away for a long time, as far as the last I heard.
Interesting.
I mean, and this is for ripping people off. Yeah. He would go on coast to coast, and he would say, invest your money here. He would take your money, and he wasn't even a registered representative. It's illegal to do that. Okay. Art Bell let him do that. He enabled him. He enabled him greatly. So this is the kind of detrimental aspects you have around anything that is true, groundbreaking, or interesting. There's all these like demons coming out of the woodwork to get at it. And I will just make a reference that I only realized last night. And this is certainly not to push Christianity on anyone. Mm-hmm. But if you think of the story of Christianity, and if you attribute it to being historically approximate, if not accurate, the biblical stuff, you have King Herod slaughtering at least 1,000 young males when the Christ is born, because he recognizes it as competition. So you have this idealized being coming in that is positioned as the savior in Christianity. He's accompanied by, 1,000 killed babies. This is a horrific idea. So, maybe you might posit that it's better that he doesn't come, or he doesn't belong here, because when he comes, life is worse, so to speak. And life did become worse in many aspects after that. And I'm not minimizing, in this statement, I don't mean to minimize the religion or minimize the idea or the idea of the Christ itself. It's just that this is what humanity is preoccupied with, trauma and drama. Anyway, that's why when you have a new release of information or something, just like with the Tesla technology back in 1908 or whenever it was, it's squashed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it tends to open up a lot more doors of questioning than the power structures, so to speak, would like to be opened. The floodgates.
Well said. The status quo becomes unmocked or disestablished.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always very quick to look at mythology, because in what you had is, in mythology, you had the god of the heavens, Uranus, had to be castrated by Saturn because Uranus was nonstop compulsive creation, nonstop. And Uranus in Kabbalah or astrology rules technology. So now you have all of these incredible new technologies, internet technologies, Silicon Valley. It becomes super creative, and now it's becoming, it can even become oppressive. So this is why Saturn comes by with his scythe, and he castrates Uranus, and then Uranus is not going to create anymore. He's going to be restrained. He's stopped, and Saturn is, the sun rules the sign of Capricorn. It's all about order, structure, but Saturn is too structured and too establishment, too status quo, too controlling. So then Jupiter or Jove or Zeus comes along and escapes Jupiter and kills him and takes over as the god of Olympus. So this is what happens when you have too much ideas of breakthrough, changing technology, changing the oil industry, changing all these established guards. Mm-hmm. And certainly time travel is very befuddling to the human mind. If you take away all the conspiracy, the human mind is completely absorbed in three-dimensional reality, mm-hmm. and living on three-dimensional sustenance with three-dimensional references. When you begin to take these references away or shut them off and open them up to new time references in other times, in other places, and you take the body, it's like, what about that utility bill you had to pay? What about, your cell phone and the emails you have to answer? Mm-hmm. And now you're in, 20 years ago, 200 years ago, and you go to 200 years ago, they're probably not even going to understand the way you speak, or vice versa. It's mm-hmm. going to be very strange. So going back into time, aside from whatever changes might occur, has its own drawbacks, let alone going into the future. What is that really like? Might be very uncomfortable. I don't know, not having traveled.
For sure. Speaking a little bit about technology, I know your most recent series is translated works by what is it, Radu Cinamar? Is that how you say it?
Radu Cinamar.
Okay.
That's how you might say it in Romanian, but we call him Radu Cinamar in English. because that's how people pronounce it. And he is a intelligent agent, for lack of a better word, in Romania's most secret intelligence division, referred to as Department Zero in the book. The government itself is not all that expository about Department Zero. Many people don't know about it. I spoke to a person very high up in the Romanian government. He was a senator, and he was completely flabbergasted that not only what I had to say, but that there was a book out of this, and that there were, tens of thousands of people in Romania and around the world who knew about the book, and he didn't, or even the ideas presented in the book. He was oblivious.
Wow.
Further stating that he would have had to have signed the budget for it to be approved, because he was on the finance committee during that time happened. He was a very important position in finance. I said, well, if you read the book, you'll see that the funding was provided outside of the Romanian government, and that's explained in the book by an investment scheme by one of the generals. But anyway, yes, so this is a book about a chamber that was discovered beneath the Romanian Sphinx. The Romanian Sphinx is a stone structure that's estimated to be about 50,000 years old. And if you stand, they now have a platform there. If you stand on the platform, which is to the northwest of the Sphinx, you will see the profile of what from the left side looks exactly like a Sphinx. From the right side, they don't have a platform. People don't recognize this. You will see what looks like a griffin, a lion-esque being, but I identify it as a griffin from the right side, all of which is consistent with the legends of the Sphinx. But this underneath this stone edifice, I think it's about 300 yards underneath, they discovered a chamber that, when I say they, it wasn't the Romanians who discovered it, it was the Pentagon with underground penetrating radar, ground penetrating radar. And it was a sophisticated type of, it might have even been laser, which was referred to as radar, but they could, and there was a certain area chamber they could not penetrate or see what was there. It was anomalous. So the Romanians, Department Zero was approached through an agent of Freemasonry, an Italian Freemason, and the whole first book in the series, Transylvania Sunrise, goes into the machinations, the political machinations to be able to open this chamber with secret cooperation between the Romanian and Americans. One of the best corroborative points of this collaboration is seen right after this occurs. NATO then accepts Romania. Romania becomes a part of NATO, where it wasn't before. So you see a very strong alliance between the two governments, which did not exist from the end of the communist era all the way up to when this occurred. So in this chamber is technology, which is estimated to be some 50,000 years old at least. It's more futuristic than it is ancient. And it includes the ability to read out, say, if you put your hand over a table that's quite huge, giant table for a giant sized person, over a certain section of it, it will read out your DNA to the molecular form. If you put it closer, it will read it out to the atomic form. And I imagine if you put it closer, it might even read it out to a quantum reference point. I don't know. They didn't go that far in the book. But also there are other portions of this table or other tables where if you put your hand over it, it will read out the DNA of a different life form. And it will also be from a different planet and a different star system. And it will show all this in holographic form. If you put your hand over two different sections simultaneously, it will read out a hybridization. So this might be, you might put your hand over and see a zebra-looking creature from Andromeda. And if you put your hand over another spot, you might see a koala-type looking creature from the Pleiades. and you might see a combination of what those two a zebra and a koala might look like. This is just my own imagination. They don't talk about such animals, but they do talk about different types of species from different planets and star systems are what this would read out. And this is enough to keep one's mind busy, fascinated, and occupied. But if you go deeper into the chamber, you will find what they refer to as a projection hall, whereby you can view a holographic screen or image of the history of the world. So you can go back and look at the history. And the technology is bioresonant, meaning that if you look into it, it will be different than if I look into it, because we're different people with different experiences. If you're, in England and more familiar with the history of England, you might see all sorts of English history, where my gaze at English history might be much more minimal because I have much less experience, and it might be much more connected to Americans and other points of interest that I might have of world history, just as you might have. So this is an opportunity to, it's like watching cable TV or the History Channel, only it's a history that's much more extensive and much more 3D and much more real, particularly as to your own subjective inclinations. Within that projection hall, there are 3 tunnels. And all of this, it fascinates me as I say this, because this is not I'm not making this stuff up. Mm-hmm. I'm reading what was presented to me in translated form that's coming out of some quarter of information. And you have to say, even if you don't believe a word of what I'm saying, it's a damned fascinating story. Mm-hmm. They get A+ for creativity, cohesiveness, and a certain authenticity. Authenticity in terms of where author and authenticity become synonymous. But within this projection hall is 3 tunnels, one of which goes to a similar device beneath the Giza Plateau in Egypt. Another one goes, and that's called the first tunnel. The second tunnel, and these are the subject of books. It's the 3rd book in the series is Mystery of Egypt, the first tunnel, where they explore this tunnel. The second tunnel is explored in the 5th book, called Inside the Earth, the 5th tunnel, or the second tunnel. And that is where Radu eventually, after many years, this story is developed over almost 2 decades, and he is able to contact and visit Earth civilizations within the center of the Earth, or the inner Earth. He goes into a whole scientific dissertation on what the inner Earth is about and why conventional scientific opinions are very flawed. And that's an argument that is presented very intelligently. The 3rd tunnel, which is the subject of a book that has just been published called The Etheric Crystal, the 3rd tunnel, actually goes all the way to Tibet, where there's a similar installation. However, and he only touches on it in this book, it goes to a city in Romania. It has branches. The main tunnel goes to Tibet, but it has branches that goes off to a city in Romania called Buzău, which is in the western part of Romania and has always had a lot of strange activity associated with it, but most people have never heard of it unless they're Romanian. There's another branch goes off to Iraq and the general area of Baghdad, and then the main branch goes off to Tibet with another branch to Mongolia. They all have similar installations. They're all a bit different. And these, the one that goes off to Tibet, he's not allowed to talk about it right now. This book talks about going to the one in Baghdad and recovering a crystal, which is described as an etheric crystal that is brought back for study and discussed in the 7th book, The Etheric Crystal. So this is a general overview of what was discovered. It's important to state, however, as I already alluded to, this story has been going on for almost 2 decades. The chamber was breached in 2003, in August of 2003. And at the time the first book was written, it had only been explored for about 6 weeks. So what's in the book, the first book, is only about 6 weeks of exploration of the tunnel, of the chamber itself. And then slowly it develops. End of paragraph.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And it kind of gets me thinking a little bit about kind of the interconnectivity of things. I know that your research has kind of taken you all over the place, and that you've kind of researched a lot. And I feel like a lot of it ends up linking back into kind of more of the native histories, the Moorish histories, and then eventually you go back to ancient Egypt or ancient Kemet. Would you be willing to kind of talk a little bit about the kind of interconnections between these different places around the world?
Yes. Okay, one has to understand that I was initially hearing this remarkable story, just like the Romanian story was remarkable. I was hearing a remarkable story from Preston Nichols about Montauk, New York, Montauk Project, which he also said was loaded with Nazis. There were Nazis all over Long Island. And then, of course, historically, this is very true. And I even wrote a book to explain that connection. It's called The Black Sun, Montauk's Nazi-Tibetan connection. But when I began to study the work of Preston Nichols, or the stories of Preston Nichols, wrote the book. When I wrote the book with him, I got about as inside of a, understanding and insider's look as one could have through his lens. And of course I have my own lens. And his work, was tied to a lot of occultism. And the whole Montauk Project was. Now what happened and I won't go into the details in a short podcast like this, but when I began to try to verify what Preston talked about, or even begin to study it, I began to have experiences with coincidence or synchronicity. And these happened at a rather significant rate, which is outside the bounds of normal coincidence. And there were 2 paths of investigation, which are delineated in my recent silver anniversary edition of the Montauk Project, the silver anniversary, which was written 25 years after the initial book, which explains that there were 2 investigations of the Montauk Project. One was a journalistic investigation, which Preston participated in that equally. And we would take several trips out to Montauk, and we established that there was illegal electrical transmissions going on, that the place was being illegally occupied. And there was even a court case over it that Preston had after getting ticketed for being on the property illegally, when in fact he wasn't. He won the case. And as a result of that, the New York State's Parks Commissioner ordered the video from Sky Books, the Montauk tour, which showed the state of the base and showed that it was operating illegally. And she eventually, and this took many years, attempted to get the place cleaned up. And that place is now a state park where anybody can go on. Before it was not. It was closed off. You were forbidden to go there. There was no reason. I found out that the property was ceded to the state by the US government with a quitclaim deed, which means they can go back and take it anytime they want. They retained all underground mining rights. So the state does not have access to any underground facilities or caverns. Of course, they had huge undergrounds because it was a military base. It was part of the Eastern Shield defense to warn off incoming missiles or projectiles or planes of any kind with the radar system that was out there. The radar itself operated at what Preston called the window frequency of the human consciousness, approximately 435 megahertz. That could affect the way people think and whatnot. And that's what the experiments were exploiting. However, as I had all of these coincidences, as a result of them, I was led to a book at the library where I discovered that there were pyramids at Montauk in about the book was published in about 1908, 1910, 1912, and they showed that there were pyramids, and it said the pyramids Montauk, but there was no explanation of them. I put them in the book, called the book Pyramids of Montauk, which is just being reprinted currently, and for the 5th or 6th time. But in that book, what I found out as I started to study why were there pyramids, I couldn't get any information except to find out that Camp Hero was once the sacred land of what were known as the Montauk Pharaohs. The Montauk Pharaohs were the royal tribe of Long Island. They were a Native American tribe who claimed to have descended from Egypt and the pharaohs of Egypt. So this is a very important synchronicity, because although there's not much written on the history of the pharaohs, other than there are certain people with the last name of Pharaoh in the tribe, is that the pharaoh in Egyptology is the interlocutor between heaven and earth. There's even a book by Ralph Ellis called Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, which portrays Jesus as indeed a pharaoh, just as Moses was of the pharaoh. Interlocutor between the heaven and the earth, the steward between this dimension and that dimension. So everything was taking on more deeper meanings as I began to investigate. Now, the positioning of Montauk in relation to Egypt, if you put it on a global grid, and you can kind of see how if you start putting the earth into the form of what Buckminster Fuller's buckyballs or geometric configurations, you see that there is a correspondence with Montauk and Egypt in terms of its angularity, in terms of the way things might have shifted, and the so-called energy of the Great Pyramid is correspondent to. So Montauk, I found, independent of my investigation, was a very recognized point of secret societies that really don't talk about it, other than that there were, it was a point of interest and considered a point of power. And of course, the Montauk Indians their land was taken. They were declared extinct in 1910, even though there was a courtroom full of them. They were told that they were too black to be Indians. And here's where we get to the Moors, the indigenous Moors. I found out because, and the way synchronicities work, in my second book, Montauk Revisited, Adventures in Synchronicity, I was handed a series of synchronicities that I won't go into because it's a little complicated, but they all led to the disappearance of a woman named Marcia Moore, a yoga instructor from Massachusetts, who went out to Big Sur in California and just disappeared. Later, I believe her body was recovered. But at the time I wrote the book, I did not have that knowledge. I later found that on the internet. But Marcia Moore, there were other strange coincidences about her. But what ultimately, years and years later, I found out that there was a connection with her name Moore, M-O-O-R-E. However, it tied into the phonetics of the name Moor, M-O-O-R. The blackish people, they're not always black, Moors of Africa, Western Africa, the Moorish civilization. Now, this, I would later find out that the word Moor first appeared in the lexicon of the American language, or the American history, I should say, not the language so much, but the history, in a court case in Delaware, where it was an argument over the rights of a Moor. But these Moors were the Delaware Moors. They were tied to the Lenni Lenape Indians, who were one of the Indian tribes that the Montauk Pharaohs or Montauk Indians descended from. So here was, and there are a lot of dark-skinned Indians on the eastern end of Long Island. The Shinnecock Indians, who were cousins to the Montauks genetically, are very dark-skinned. The Montauks feature people with dark skin. But you see, I would learn through my other research is that the Moors were here before the white people came. The Moors were indigenous to America. America once had a name called Almaricanos. This is where America comes from. But instead of telling us that, they say it came from a navigator named Amerigo Vespucci. Why do you name a whole continent after a navigator? After his first name. Like, you don't call Columbia Christopher, you call it Columbus or Columbia. You name it after the last name, not the first name. And so Almaricanos means El Morocco. America was a extension or a colony of the Sultan of Morocco. And if you study American history, you'll find out the first treaty between America, with America, foreign treaty, was with Morocco. So there was an alliance there. And the reason this treaty came about is because the Sultan of Morocco was enraged that his subjects were being turned into slaves by Americans, his subjects that were already in America. Now, you have a word in America that's called sheriff. And this was after the term sharif. Sharif, an Islamic or Arabic word, which referred to the fact of a sheriff. The sheriffs would wear a fez. This is why cops are sometimes called the fuzz, because the fez are after you, the fuzz would turn into the fuzz. So you had, and then you have all these place names in America like Cairo, Illinois, Cairo, New York, Memphis, which is an Egyptian name, Memphis, Tennessee. There are many place names and a lot of hidden, unacknowledged, and unfathomed history in America. So this is how I discovered the indigenous aspect and how I came into contact with the Moors and became friends with the Moors, who enlightened me to more and more of their history, which goes deeper and deeper. But that's an overview.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I've even heard it so much as to say that there was East Egypt and West Egypt, and that there was the Nile. The Mississippi was also called the Nile. I don't know how true that is, but I've heard some.
I have heard that as well.
Stuff about that.
What's interesting is about the Mississippi is there is a place called Montauk, Missouri, and I would like to go there sometime. There's not much there from what I've heard. Mm-hmm. One of my readers went there and reported on it to me. But if you go to Montauk, when I first looked up Montauk, Missouri, it's spelled the same way as Montauk, New York. It was said that it was named after Montauk, New York, because of people who had settled from Montauk, New York. But the history of, as I was able to put together, there was once a great, what do you call him? Not mariner, Prince Madoc. Prince Madoc of, he's identified with England, also identified as the brother of King Arthur, according to author Alan Wilson. But Prince Madoc is said to have come up the Mississippi River with what are known as the Welsh Indians. Now, separately, the Montauks had their own Welsh Indians. But these Welsh Indians had blue eyes, and they would intermix with the population. There's a lot of place names in Tennessee, extending up into Kentucky, that are old, that have the name Madoc and also Arthur. And he made his way up all the way to at least Montana, where the descendants were the Mandan Indians, which is another name that's much like Montauk, Mandan. And then this extended migration extended westward to Modoc Indians of California, which are just right around Mount Shasta. They were the last tribe to be subdued in California. But so that's a very interesting thread of like coming up the Mississippi, and there's still descendants of these people to this very day. So there was a strong identification with Egypt. Madoc's roots, according to Alan Wilson, go back to Egypt, where he was connected to Egypt and came to England during the Dark Ages. King Arthur would have been around 300 or 400 more or less in that time period.
Yeah, it's all very fascinating, and it's interesting too, because I feel like it kind of links into a little bit of something that I know you've touched on a little bit. And I don't know exactly what this has to do. I mean, I know that there's the Shriners, but then I also know that in Ang's Hat, right, there was a group that kind of considered themselves Moors or Shriners, or how could you get a little bit into that, into the Ang's Hat?
Well, Ang's Hat was at the time. It's now a book that I published, Ang's Hat, the beginning. But Ang's Hat was presented to me as a manuscript as I was finishing my book, Montauk Revisited. And it was about a travel brochure. And it was an article about the travel brochure written by Peter Lamborn Wilson. And the name Wilson stood out to me and what caught my interest in it. But it took me years before I could even meet the person who was behind the publication on the internet of the Ang's Hat travel brochure. That was Joseph Matheny. And he was a computer scientist who likes to call himself a transmedia artist, which is definitely an accurate description of him. And he had published this on the internet, this about this interdimensional egg or portal that was created by an ashram that included scientists, hippies, and Sufi Muslims that met near Ang's Hat, New Jersey, in a cabin where they worked. Or there was a commune there. Now, what was interesting about that, it was sort of an endeavor that bridged all sorts of different disciplines and ideas. But one of the things they referred to was the Moorish Science Temple. And the Moorish Science Temple was something I had never heard of. And that was something that made the Moors stand out to me. I studied the history of the Moorish Science Temple to a limited extent in Peter Lamborn Wilson's book, Sacred Drift. And there was also, Peter Lamborn Wilson referred to a organization called the Moorish Orthodox Church, which I think he belonged to. I'm pretty sure he did. But they were associated with this Ang's Hat. But the Moorish Orthodox Church was a sort of a CIA inspired or affiliated organization, which had nothing to do with the Moors, because the Moors were not a church. A church is a Christian word, and the Moors were not Christians. Sometimes they were Muslim, but first and foremost, they were Moors. And the Moorish Orthodox Church operated out of Millbrook with Timothy Leary's League of Spiritual Discovery, or LSD. So Leary was involved with the Moorish Orthodox Church. That really has nothing to do with anything that's authentic. It's sort of a attempt to co-opt the Moorish, the very rich Moorish heritage. That answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's kind of what the Shriners as well. I feel like they attempted to co-opt a lot of that.
Well, the Shriners are all about Egypt. So see, Egypt is in many ways a central mystery to the planet. People recognize it as a central mystery to the planet because it has all of this incredibly, it's like some elaborate board game that somebody's trying to figure out. And you go to the internet, and there's all this stuff about the Great Pyramid. However, all of these people, in my experience, that go and write books about Egypt and go there and do this, that, and the other thing, they are completely clueless to the secret of the Great Pyramid. And the only one I ever met who well, I wouldn't say the only one. Well, he was, who understood the essence of the whole pyramid. It's about integrating all of that into your breath. This is my Qigong instructor, Roosevelt Caney, who taught Qigong, which can also be pronounced Qigong. And this is the ancient, he used to call it the ancient Kemetic art, Kemet. And he knew so much about Egypt and the pyramid. And it's all about accessing the energy of the pyramid. And the body is structured in pyramidal shapes as well. So this is the secret of life. The Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, was more properly translated as the Egyptian Book of the Breath, because you need to breathe to go to the next world. The next world, well, life is a process of breathing, which is an in and out process. When you die, your breathing will stop to the degree that your body dies, but the in and out process of your mind, body, soul, or your mind and soul, ka, ba, all of that is going to be engaged in an in and out process of yin and yang. That does not stop. That does not stop. So that's the secret. That's some of the greatest secrets that I've learned in all of my journeys, is the importance of the breath.
Yeah, the breath is really definitely an important thing. And it's interesting. It connects into, I know that there's breathing techniques that some would say would release DMT in the brain. And then there's also, I don't know if you're familiar, there's a YouTube channel out there, I believe it's called Beyond the Veil. They actually traveled to the pyramids in Egypt and took acacia. And acacia is one of the plants that has the highest amounts of DMT in it. And they took acacia in the pyramids. And essentially they said that they, and I'll link this back in here in a second, but essentially they said that the pyramids were used as a mechanism to, once you had the DMT, once you had, I'm sure there's other methods beyond the acacia, which would be the breathing techniques, but once you had that, the pyramids would actually be used as a projectile to project your consciousness beyond the 12th dimension into the 13th dimension.
But let me clarify. When you say acacia, you're referring to acacia leaves or Akashic records?
Acacia leaves are the bushes.
That's what you're referring to. You're referring to acacia. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Because Akashic records will sometimes be referred to as Akasha or acacia. So I just wanted to clarify that, disambiguated. Okay, so you were saying that the pyramid would amplify the experience or the concentration of the psychedelic projection of what DMT could, would, or might do.
Yeah, and even beyond that, potentially psychedelic, potentially just breath work or meditation. And then I know that there was also a story of, and what they had said was that they went and they fixed the system so that we could then have the weighing of the feather again, which apparently, according to them, had been turned off by Aleister Crowley, who had done similar rituals in the pyramids years prior. and which I think that's really fascinating. That links back in. I know you've done a little bit of research into Aleister Crowley and
Yeah,
kind
but
of,
I mean, that's a very fanciful projection, in my opinion. That how he had the power to turn off the feather of Mott.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, people identify. What I would say about Aleister Crowley is Aleister Crowley was somebody who performed a magical ritual in the Great Pyramid with his wife. In he was married on August 12th, 1903. He took his honeymoon trip to Egypt, where he performed a ritual in the Great Pyramid. This means he had sex with his wife in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. And then he began to make this discovery called the Book of the Law. Now, the Book of the Law was considered the greatest secret in occultism, but not just by Crowley, but all the people who followed and worshipped him or appreciated him. He said he did not understand the Book of the Law, although he wrote and talked about it all the time. He said someone would come after him who would explain it. And there was a man who was kicked out of Aleister Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis organization who did decode it. He had a natural gift for decoding it. The Ordo Templi Orientis considered him a crackpot. He was probably part crackpot, I think it's fair to say, but he had a great acumen for understanding. And I spilled it out with courtesy of him in my book, Montauk Book of the Living, where I explain that what Crowley was putting in his Book of the Law was a code. He was showing a code of what DNA was like. This is before DNA was discovered. And the DNA corresponds to the Hebrew Kabbalah. It's all when somebody does the Hebrew Kabbalah, they are basically studying life, and it mimics the geometry of DNA. So Aleister Crowley, and my point here is that when Aleister Crowley went to do magic in the pyramid is working him, not the other way around.
Yeah.
He is not so masterful as to, be doing this, that, and the other thing. The pyramid is the power, not Aleister Crowley. And of course, he did what he could to, become I could see how somebody could say that, because he calls himself the Antichrist. But the tradition of the feather of Mott is Mott was the consort of Tehuti, the builder of the Great Pyramid. So she's the one that would have the feather of Mott that would put your heart on one scale and put a feather on the other. And if your heart was too heavy, you'd be condemned to go to the underworld or to go back and live again. So that becomes an individual situation and a crisis. The only time I can think of when somebody would be saying you can have the feather of, Aleister Crowley turned off the feather of Mott. Now it's been reversed. It's almost like you're selling somebody a seminar where they can now experience the feather of Mott and go beyond. And this is an individual thing.
Yeah.
You could indeed achieve most anything in a seminar if the circumstances were right for you, any given seminar. But that's not the type of thing where you sign up for a course or a level and you're going to be, all of a sudden free of the judgment of the feather. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
It's nice to think about. I mean, it's a creative exercise for sure.
Yeah, well, I guess they were kind of saying that it had been turned, that the wane of the feather had been turned off, so souls were automatically recycling back into Earth without having that option even.
The soul cannot have an option unless the soul is awake. Once the soul is awake, the soul has an option to continue or to do nothing. But you would see many people who are addicted to food that is improper to eat for them. It's very hard to get them to even get up to making a choice. You have a choice of whether to eat sugar, processed foods, or whatever it is that's destructive to your body. You have a choice. But until you recognize it as an option, it's not a choice. And this is what we live in, a cycle of a squirrel cage. And if it applies to, I mean, it sounds like a very aggrandized, self-serving statement to say that. But it's, people say that sort of things all the time.
Yeah.
It's all individual. It's like if you recognize that, what's good about it though, is if you say you now have the option, it puts in your head that you have that choice, which you do. You always have that choice. But so much for that. That's fine.
Are you familiar with the book The ISIS Thesis?
No, I haven't heard of the book of the ISIS Thesis.
It's by an author. Her name's Judy something. I forget what her last name is. But she kind of goes into this a little bit too as well, in regards to the ISIS Thesis is kind of a breaking down of the various Egyptian books of the dead and the kind of the process of which one has to go through to awaken the ability to have that choice, kind of what you're talking about. And it has to do with, in her mind, it has to do with the aura, but the aura is nothing more than an extension of our microbiomes. Really fascinating stuff. But basically saying that the ancient Egyptians knew about our microbiomes on the quantum level, and that a lot of their writings were actually really brilliant in regards to how to heal the body, using various things to be able to then access these different, the weighing of the feathers, so to speak, and to then know where to travel from there to make sure that your body awakens in the way that it's supposed to.
Well, there's a lot of lost knowledge about the Egyptians, but you have to remember that a lot of what they talked about, and there's obviously a priest class that had more accumulated more academic, for lack of a better word, information than the rest of the people working the fields. But it's kind of like, we know how to turn on a TV, use a remote, use a cell phone, operate a toaster, drive a car. All these things are so second nature to us that if you go back into Egypt, so much of that stuff was second nature to them. It's like, because they are, we are evolving out of a primordial condition. They are evolving into a non-primordial condition. So all of that stuff, all of that primordial consciousness, which people like get so fascinated with, is second nature to them. It's, just like when a mortician services a body, it's all second nature. And part of that second nature is arranging for a service to be done with whatever denomination the family chooses for the body. But it's all sort of like, that's a very kind of simplistic compared to what the Egyptians did. But it was all kind of like second nature. This is the way things are because we know this. It's a different perspective than we have today, but it's much more natural to them because they didn't have to worry about what television program they were going to watch or what politician they were going to read about on the internet or which angle of the election. They're not, their minds aren't preoccupied with what drugstore they're going to go to, what's their doctor appointment, how many miles do you have to drive, this sort of thing. No, it's different. Our minds are completely and utterly different.
Yeah, we were inundated with layers and layers of distractions.
Yes, that goes away from the primordial consciousness. And that's what Egypt represents, as do all of those so-called great civilizations.
Yeah, and we have. I feel like we though. I don't know if you feel this, but I do feel like we are at kind of a very fascinating point in human history. Um, like it's taken a lot to get us to where we are, and I do feel like that there is some sort of calling, and I don't know what it would be. I know that you've kind of referred to different things as the inner Earth beings, or as Palladians, or these different types of extraterrestrial or fallen angels, or do you think that there's some sort of like calling that they're kind of giving us clues and kind of trying to bring us back into that more ancient awareness?
Well, what all this directs to is what you can call the apocalypse,
Mm-hmm.
or the end times. And never a subject I cared for at all, the end times. And I could only associate that with my first experience of hearing about the end times, of my neighbor telling me about Jehovah's Witnesses who would, go up on a mountain and wait for the world to end. And, they would give away their I remember he's in their TV set, like, TV set is like the be all and the end all. You're giving away, they give away their TV, they give away everything because they, the world was going to end.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd go up on the mountain and the world wouldn't end. So, I don't know if they got their TV set back or not. I don't even know if Jehovah's Witnesses watch TV, but I don't really know. This is what I was told. And I thought, that's, and then who did they give the TV set to? Because what's the person going to need the TV set? Is this a gesture to say, I care for you, you can have the TV set? Or I'm showing you how I'm trying to impress you by giving you my TV set because I know the world's going to end. I'm creating an effect on you.
Yeah.
I don't know. But this is the first time I heard of the end of the world. And, these people obviously didn't have a good head on their shoulders on this subject. So, and this is something that has gone on throughout the course of humanity, waiting for the world to end. This is the story. And this story was originally told by, it appears in Buddhist literature attributed to the Buddha, but not in these words. It's the story of Chicken Little. The sky is falling. The sky is falling. The sky is falling. So this is and certainly what you say is like society, it seems to be at a very critical point where you have all of these people on the earth, more people than we've ever, I think there's more people on the earth than have existed in the history of humanity. So if you believe in reincarnation, you have to account for where did all these other people come from? Or is this their first life? It doesn't. I'm not trying to invalidate the idea of reincarnation. I'm just trying to say you have to account for that. But so there are a lot of, and now also we have in this information age, we have information coming out of the woodworks. So we have all of this information which presents much more information than we had 30, 40, 50 years ago that can be accessed and processed just for individuals. So, it changes the economy, it changes the information. If you consider the whole universe is nothing but information, it's like now we're processing the universe, but we're processing it in terms of code. There's computer code, and there's also letters and words, which are a code for concepts. So we're dealing with a much greater and abundant flow of information with diverse viewpoints that certainly create a lot more stimulation, not only in our minds, but in the universe itself. There's a lot more buzz going on. If this equates to the end times, I can't say, but it certainly encourages one to think about them a lot more, because there is so much more to think about. And when you talk about a DMT, which is an amplification of one's psychic sensories, yeah, you could if you're reading a lot about the end of the world and all of the associated esoteric information connected to that, it can get pretty, I suppose, intense. But then again, one of the great secrets of Zen was, before enlightenment, carrying wood, chopping wood, carrying water. After enlightenment, chopping wood, carrying water. You're still doing the same thing. Enlightenment is in between the daily drudgery or work or of the day in and day out substance. So I don't know. Yeah, we're in a different age. Things are happening at a different rate. One has to adapt to different faculties of one's consciousness in order to survive. But, I wouldn't say that, the end of the world is more like a passage, like when you end, you end your life. That's the end of that system of consciousness. That's gonna be over. Every ending has a beginning. So, but certainly we're in critical time periods, if it answers your question.
Yeah, well, even the word apocalypse itself is like, we have a lot of these connotations with it, but it just essentially means to reveal, or a revelation. So it's like in a revelation, we're kind of amidst that revelation with all the information being as profoundly available as it is.
I can say something about the word apocalypse, because I studied it and wrote about it in one of my books. It's apo in Greek is uncovering. Calypso, apocalypso, apocalypse. It comes from calypso. Calypso was, of course, the goddess that people are probably familiar from the Johnny Depp Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the goddess Calypso. But Calypso was a goddess in Greek mythology, or and of course, where the name Calypso is very interesting, because it comes from the root, and there's a big similarity between Greek and Sanskrit. It comes from the Hindu word Kali. Ipso in Greek is by way of, or by fact of, Kali. So it would be the uncovering of Kali, or by fact of Kali. Kali is the ancient goddess of time, and she was totally related to time. So it's like she's the dark mother of time. She's been portrayed as a killer. Well, what is time as a killer? We all die in time. So it's all about, it gets personified into a horrific beast-like creature, but there's much more to it than that. So the unveiling, the revelation, my work is focused on time, the revelation of time, because there are other, all the time is happening all at once. And it's up to us to view it, because we have a limited viewer. We have a lens that is very limited in terms of our human mind and our human body. And we get excited about the prospect that we might be able to view more. And we maybe, people will want to take DMT, LSD, or whatever to see what's outside. Doesn't always work out so well. But and then there's ideas of the projection of consciousness, like in the books that I published about, looking through these bioresonant holographic devices or viewers, whereby you can look back and see what's beyond the shadow, what's beyond the veil. And this is, of course, it's understandably exciting. Ultimately, one has to come back to balance. And I suppose I've been very fortunate to have a life where, the investigation and contemplation of these things has been remunerative to the degree that I can, exist in this world and hold on to a status quo while at the same time contemplating the more esoteric aspects of the universe. It's been a real opportunity to learn and to educate myself. So these are exciting times, and there's even more. I think one of the greatest problems, like I've met young people, and I'll say this to them, they're very extremely read. They've read everything, and it's almost like they should say, you read too much. You better stop reading because you don't know anything.
Mm-hmm.
I don't say that to them, but because I'm not trying to demean them, but it becomes very obvious. Whereas somebody of their age might refer to them as a know-it-all. They've read too much, and they're reciting data rather than actually,
embodying it,
knowing it, having, whatever, however knowledge comes. I never, I guess it comes through experience and doing stuff, and then you can, I guess, have more of an idea of knowing what you're talking about. But all as it is experience, whereby you could have somebody who's read and has virtually no experience other than reading. Mm-hmm. And reading is good, but at some point you have to do something, and that's different for each individual.
Mm-hmm. You can have all the gnosis in the world, but without wisdom, it's kind of like you're blowing in the wind. It's like
well, I wouldn't give too much credit to that sort of knowledge as gnosis. Gnosis is more of a deep is a wisdom.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
I because that's really gnosis is really knowing it, and it is a wisdom. I mean, I don't know how to disambiguate the two words, but it's. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is just and this is so funny to me because my wife and I were just did a hike up to a mountain in New York, and we must have sat there eating our lunch, minding our own business. There's a lot of people around doing the same thing. Heard two guys and a girl and a guy. They must have spent at least 20 minutes, because I didn't start listening to them until about 10 minutes, talking about the ratio between chocolate and peanut butter in a Reese's peanut butter cup and the products made by the Reese's company, and then went on to morph the conversation into nuts and how to buy nuts at the local drugstore, CVS, and all the different packages of nuts. And it was like, what on earth is this? How can they engage their minds in talking about nuts, confectionaries? Mm-hmm. I mean, this wasn't how to bake what do they call those things? Those Italian desserts or whatever, cannolis. It's not the refinement of some recipe. It's just talking stuff about nonsense. I could understand if they were talking about Broadway, the opera, sports, because that's sort of a random engagement of conversation, but mm-hmm. not Reese's peanut butter cups. This is what's in these people's minds. I don't know. So that's not gnosis. That's like you have cornflakes in your head. They might even have fairly intelligent positions. I don't know, but they were talking as if they had cornflakes in their head, and it was serious. It was a serious conversation. It wasn't joking.
Yeah. Wild.
Anything else you'd like to ask me before we wrap up?
Well, there's a few things that I kind of wanted to ask, but I might just save those for a next time if possible. And I kind of just want to, I guess the last thing I'll kind of leave people with is like, is there anything, I want to leave the listeners with a little bit of positivity. Could you give us some like potential actions that we can kind of start to take in our lives that you have things you've learned, maybe more in line with the Qigong and the diets and these types of things that you can leave us with to kind of help inspire.
Yeah, we're facing some very intense times right now with if you take aside all of the bizarre stuff of the election in the United States right now, because we're right now, we're talking, today is November 16th, and there's still a contested election for the president and all sorts of political rhetoric that is just quite mad. And in addition to situations that are not being addressed, that should be addressed, that neither side shows any sign of genuinely addressing. This is the real, this is the sort of, right now as I speak in time, the planetary situation is such that we have a Pluto conjunction in Capricorn with Jupiter, which magnifies all of this upheaval of government. The government is a authoritative body which has a certain job to do. It's going to change structurally and dynamically in the next few months. But the only thing that you can do for yourself is steer your own reality. And that becomes, like, I could tell people they should, I'm going to be offering a Qigong course in the coming months, hopefully weeks. I'm not that far away from launching it, a mini course to help people to breathe. Breath equals life, breath equals spirit. And to where your mind goes, your energy goes. There are a lot of distractions in one's life. I can only offer my relatively small input into people's life, but your breath is very important. Your diet is very important. One of the things the course will feature, and anybody can do this, is to start writing down daily. This is not a diary in the sense that you're writing a diary because you want to write a diary. You're writing a diary. You're going to write down what you eat and what you do during the day. It doesn't have to be an elaborate diary. It's more of a bullet point. I ate cornflakes. I ate eggs. I ate a hamburger. I ate, 6 Hershey bars, whatever you ate. And then after a week, you look at what you're doing and, okay, what did I do? How did I spend my time? What did I eat? Should I change my diet? What am I drinking? Should I hydrate properly? And this is to make yourself smarter of getting in touch with your day-to-day activity and where are you going with it. In other words, what are you actually doing versus what do you think you're doing? What do you want to do? And this is what I would recommend. And when I do this course, I'm going to have people do it for 30 days before they can do the next course. Because you don't, and I'll be teaching very rudimentary Qigong, which is centered around breathing, elongating your breath. And you want them to be in a position where they're properly hydrated, eating properly, not necessarily perfectly, but in a better situation than they were. And there's all sorts of things you can learn from the internet about diets, habits, what's good for you. But you have to think, and then that's as a prerequisite, because once you've done this, you're now qualified. You've qualified yourself to take on a bigger responsibility of taking care of your own body, mind, and spirit, because you're ultimately the one who will do it. A coach, a teacher, somebody like myself, all you can do is put one into the deep end of the pool to let them swim. But you don't put them in the deep end. You put them in the shallow end until they become so obnoxious that you have to throw them into the deep end. Otherwise, they're not going to get it. Because you don't think you need to hold your breath. Well, good, boom. Now because they'll argue with you. So anyway, that's probably is look into your own self, write down your own habits, your own, what are you doing, and review that every 7 days, and don't ever stop, because you'll make yourself smarter that way, and you're engaging in the idea of self-reflection, and you're qualifying yourself and telling yourself who you are, because that's inevitably what you do in any counseling situation or effort. When you're trying to help somebody, you get somebody to look at what they haven't been looking at. You're helping them to see how they've been dealing with their life or a problem, and they're always not looking, well, I shouldn't have said that to him. I should have reacted to that differently, et cetera, and that is inevitably how the problem's solved. Yes, I should be eating before I go to work in the morning, because that's what's depressing them or whatnot. So that's my contribution for what I think will help the people most. I think that'll help them even more than, if they do that, even more than reading any of my books or anyone else's. It's just engage your life, and that'll make yourself smarter. And you're doing it.
Yep. Take responsibility, and then really hold yourself accountable to your actions, essentially.
Exactly. Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. If you could share maybe also where they can find more information about you and your books.
That's a good idea. To look at the books that I've published, you can go to www.skybooks.usa.com, skybooks.usa.com. And I also encourage people to visit the timetraveleducationcenter.com, where you can sign up and get 7 free videos that explain the math and physics of time travel in a very simply. Might have to go through them a few times, but that's okay. I also, if you sign up for emails, I do now and then communicate and point out certain things, or direct people to certain things, announce new books and whatnot. And that's, I would invite people to do that. Thank you very much for having me on.
Oh yeah, for sure. We'll definitely have to have you on again and maybe dive a little bit deeper into some of these topics.
Okay, thank you very much.
Cool. Well, have a wonderful day.